Welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on how our brain learns languages. My name is Vita Kogan. I'm a lecturer in applied linguistics here at UCL, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Natalia Parker. Natalia, born and first educated in Russia, Natalia completed her master's in applied linguistics in 2016. She secured AHRC funding for her PhD, which she was awarded in 2022. Her research synthesizes recent findings in psycholinguistics, second language acquisition, and language pedagogy, investigating ways of optimizing learners' cognitive processing. Her textbook, based on her research, was published by Routledge in 2020 and was nominated for Book Award in Linguistics and Language Pedagogy by the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages. Natalia conducted a knowledge exchange project organizing a series of roundtables on how to learn languages more effectively, and she now teaches Russian at UCL and regularly presents at international conferences such as European Second Language Acquisition and the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to sly.do. You just have to enter this into your internet browser and then enter the event code, which is Pound Polyglot. I will now hand over to Natalia for their talk. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Vita, for this presentation, and I'm very grateful to UCL for this opportunity to talk about my research. And thank you to you all for your interest in what I do. I probably should start sharing the slides. As you can see, I will be talking about how our brains learn languages. I'm primarily a Russianist. I teach. And today we're going to talk about a three house. So the emphasis on this presentation on how the cognitive psychology and other linguistic areas and directions help teaching and learning. How do our brains process information, and where does it get lost? Because we need to know how to keep it. The second how is how do our brains store information and how to keep it better. The largest part of the presentation would be how can we help our brains produce language and use what we've learned about it more effectively. So, as I mentioned, I've been teaching languages for over 25 years, my initial research started with trying to answer the question, why don't learners learn what teachers teach? And it was I asked a few decades ago, but there is no straightforward answer to it. And I started with research in language pedagogy, which is the branch of linguistics which looks at how languages are taught and how learners learn when they're taught, which is in instructional settings. Then during my MA, a wonderful lecturer, Cookie Gill, introduced me to second language acquisition, which is the branch of linguistics which focuses specifically on how people acquire additional languages. So it looks at acquisition processes and the factors that affect it, not necessarily in instructional settings. And finally, during my PhD, one of my two wonderful supervisors, Claire Wright, introduced me to psycholinguistics, which examines how our minds handle the working of language, focusing on how humans comprehend and produce language. And this lecture is going to synthesize the findings of all these three directions. And so, and the first how was how do our brains process information? This is very generic, and this is really the cognitive psychology side of my research. When I ask people about language, they very often associate it with memory. But memory, there are different types of memory. And memory people most often think about is long-term memory. So where information kept for a long time. However, the huge breakthrough in cognitive psychology and language learning was the suggestion of working memory. It was posited by Baddeley quite a few years ago. In very simple words, working memory can be explained as some kind of a buffer which holds the initial information which comes towards us, the input. So I think working memory is amazing, and there is a huge body of research on working memory, but it has two big disadvantages, which are going to be very important for us. And the first one, it can only hold that information for a few seconds, which is not very long. After that, the information has to be passed over to the long-term memory. And this process is called encoding. So if the information doesn't make that jump between the working memory and the long-term memory, it's lost forever for that point in time. So that's the first hurdle that language learners have to overcome when they're learning. So they need to encode the information in the long-term memory. The second disadvantage of working memory, it's tiny. It has extremely small capacity, which means that no human can hold more than 7 items at a time. The other question, of course, is what an item is, but if you're interested, you can ask me in the Q&A question. But that means that we can't, when we trying to learn something, or we're reading something or listening to something, we cannot hold too much information at a time to encode. Once we encode it, it reboots, and then we can have another 7 items for a few seconds again. So the main takeaways from this concept of working memory for any language learner or any language teacher is that the information needs to be segmented. Because you see now that working memory is also used when we're trying to produce information. So this process of retrieving the information which is stored in the long-term memory back into that buffer, back into the working memory, is called retrieval. So that's the other sort of gap or abyss where the information can fall through and never make it to working memory, which means we won't produce it. And we are going to look a lot at this second retrieval. But the main takeaway, we need to feed information into our brain with very small amounts. So it would be easier to encode and it would be easier to retrieve, which means if you're trying to learn the whole declension system or the whole set of endings for a case or a long list of words, it's not going to be very effective because they are not going to make that encoding jump into the long-term memory very successfully. So that's why segment the information. So now we're going to look at long-term memory, where assume we've made that transfer from working memory into long-term memory. So now let's think how the information is going to be stored there. So when I do this kind of lectures, I normally ask, how do you imagine your brain stored? So how do you think the information is sort of placed or located in there? And believe it or not, the most common, I want you to think about it and sort of have an answer in mind. The most common answer is filing cabinets. Unfortunately, or fortunately, our brain is not that organized. And the storage doesn't look anything like filing cabinets. The second most popular answer is spider webs. It's sort of getting closer, but it's still, if you can see, there is quite organized pattern in spider webs. Our brains don't have that. Let's do a tiny little experiment. If I ask you to remember one of these two Russian words, whether you did Russian or not, it's irrelevant, which one would you remember better? And my guess, you all went for the first one. And the reason for that is quite likely that all the letters in that word are similar to English letters. You all speak English, so in the second word, it's not that obvious. So whether you know how to pronounce it or not is irrelevant, but you went for something familiar. And that's how our brains store information and encode information by establishing connection to something which is already there. So I went to a lecture once, and it was our brain was compared to this sort of space picture. It's Berlin, and you can see that the lighting system is different in East Berlin and West Berlin. And it was taken long after the Berlin Wall came down, but the connections are still there. That's how our brain is. So the best way to keep the information in the long-term memory is to establish connections. And connections don't have to be necessarily linguistic. For example, in language, there is such thing as contextualization. In language pedagogy, that's a term, which means everything you're trying to learn, you make it relevant to yourself. So if you talk about job logs down the road, your brain is going to know it's not relevant. So you cannot cheat on your brain. If you're talking about something that happened to you, your friend, the place where you live, that's actually is relevant, and the brain will connect the new language words to the event memory, which it's already got. So, and if you know other languages, you might make associations to others, or even making links to English is sometimes very helpful. So the main takeaway out of that is connect the new information you're trying to encode to the old information which is already in your brain. Now, we need to look at the retrieval process. Do you remember we had the process of encoding when the information was transferred from working memory to long-term memory? And now we are using working memory again to produce language, to use the information from the long-term memory which we encoded. So when I ask, so the next how is how we can help our brain retrieve that information to produce the language. The first person who was interested in retrieval of information, like from the scientific point of view, was Ebbinghaus. He lived in the 19th century, which is a long time ago, long before working memory was discovered. He is the first one who discovered that if you don't come back to the information you're trying to remember, you actually lose more than 50% of it. There is more modern research in second language acquisition, which shows that learners, after the first encountering the language information, lose up to 75% of information. I was horrified, because it meant that when my students leave the classroom after having had 2 hours of language, they only will remember a quarter of what I said. That's shocking. So, but Ebbinghaus experimented with trying to increase the amount of retainment, how much information he retained. He didn't work with foreign language. He worked with his first language word lists. And he discovered that if he comes back repetitively to the same list, he remembered it better. In fact, if you look, that the retainment increased very close to 100%, and he came back 5 times. There are still studies which are trying to calculate an optimum formula for this kind of repetition. Now, if we talk about the language, this kind of repetition has been used in language teaching to produce audiolingual method. It was very popular after the Second World War, and people using it were very good at producing phrases which they were learning, but unfortunately they couldn't get past that. They couldn't dismantle the phrase and put the new words in the same phrase because they didn't actually know the structure of the language. They would sort of parrot mimicking. So audiolingual method was short-lived. But what we can take from Ebbinghaus, and that's our starting point with retrieval, is that multiple retrievals of information increase the amount of information you can remember and hold in your long-term memory, and consequently produce through the working memory. So, but multiple retrievals is sort of, we need to look at them closer. So the next theory, so since Ebbinghaus, cognitive psychologists discovered that long-term memory is not uniform, and it consists of 2 different types of memory, which hold 2 different types of knowledge. So, and the first type of knowledge is declarative knowledge. In plain English, it means knowing about. For example, if you are learning to ride a bike, and somebody explains you what to do, where to put your feet, how to steer, you would have declarative knowledge of it. In language terms, if you see something like this in your language textbook, which is Russian conjugation system, or it can be English tense forms, or it can be Spanish vowel typology, you are acquiring declarative knowledge. So you're knowing about a language. The second type of knowledge is procedural knowledge. It's basically knowing how. So to actually ride a bike, declarative knowledge is not enough, because once you get on it, you probably will fall off unless you practice. When you practice, you get better at it, and then you stay on it, and you get quite good. That means that you've built your procedural knowledge. In language terms, when we open our mouth and trying to say something using this knowledge that we've acquired, that's when procedural knowledge kicks in. And very often we open our mouth and not much happens. Or if it happens, it's very slow and very effortful. So please do not think that declarative knowledge somehow is sort of transferred into procedural knowledge. These 2 memories, knowledges, they hold in different parts of the brain. And procedural knowledge is built sort of separately, very often with the use of declarative knowledge, but not necessarily. If the person repeats the same action again and again, they will build procedural knowledge and might not necessarily verbalize how they're doing it. So procedural knowledge is very sort of stable knowledge, very strong knowledge, and it's very difficult to build, but it's more difficult to break. So what we need, what teachers ideally want to know, is how to build that procedural knowledge. So when a learner opens their mouth, they can speak, they can use that theory information which they learned in class. So one of the theories which works with proceduralization or building a procedural knowledge is called skill acquisition theory. There are a few of them. I'm going to use Anderson's version of it, which is probably the most comprehensible. A skill acquisition theory talks about a few stages, and we're going to simplify it and use 3. So the first stage is cognitive stage. And Anderson, I think, experimented with cigar rolling. He had cigar rolling experiment. At cognitive stage, a person which was supposed to roll a cigar was explained how to do it. He basically formed encoded declarative knowledge. So the next stage is associative stage, when a learner is trying to use that declarative knowledge to actually execute or perform the action. And it's very slow, very effortful, because he always has to remember how to do it and try and make his muscles work in a particular way. But then eventually, they would get up to autonomous stage, when automatization occurs, which means that no or very little cognitive analysis is required, and the speed of the action increases. In other words, it becomes automatized or proceduralized. In terms of language, there are researchers who try and apply skill acquisition theory, and one of them is De Keyser, very respected, well-published researcher. But the issue that very often sort of happens with skill acquisition, that learners are very good at producing sort of vocabulary and particular phrases. But as soon as it comes to grammar, when they have to put the same ending on different items, that's when the skill acquisition doesn't quite work. In my research, I argue that it needs to be the context of retrieval. That declarative knowledge needs to be different. It needs to vary, not the same context like in adjulingual method. It needs to vary. So the same ending, for example, needs to be applied to different vocabulary items. So the skill of actually swapping an ending and the stem of the word sort of is automatized, not just the grammatical form. So my research is based on another theory of learning, which is called spiral curriculum theory, which was proposed, as you can see, quite a few years ago by Jerome Bruner, who is very often thought as a father of cognitive psychology. And I personally think Bruner was a genius, because he proposed strategy for learning long before researchers knew about working memory and declarative and procedural memory. And intuitively, he sort of addressed all the requirements for optimizing learners' processing. He didn't work with language specifically. He worked with small children and early years learning, but his theory is applied to in many areas, in particular in sciences. There are a lot of applications of spiral curriculum in mathematics and physics, but there are applications in language. For example, the entire Maori curriculum in New Zealand is built on spiral curriculum. And what I do, I apply the spiral curriculum principles to teaching Russian. But first, I'm going to introduce the main idea of spiral curriculum. What Bruner did, he took small items. To remember, working memory can only process small amounts. So introduced information in small amounts. So then he connected those items. If you watch the red block, it's always connected to yellow and blue, which are already familiar. So the new information is connected to old information. And what happens after that? If you, for example, watch the yellow block, it sort of appears quite often, sometimes more often and sometimes less often, but it's always sort of seems to be there. And so we have the new one, and then again, the yellow block appears. So Bruner introduced the topic of the revisiting. Revisiting is not the same as revising. Because when you revise, you more or less repeat the same information. So revisiting means that every time you come back to that information, you place it in the new context. So if you look at all these shapes, they're all very different. So the block performs, the yellow block, for example, performs different functions in each of these shapes. And that's how you sort of build the system of the language you're trying to learn, your target language. And that's the ideal sort of second language system. So if you now look at the shape, it's a spiral, hence spiral curriculum, but it's an inverted spiral. So, which means every time you come back, you have more and more information. You add the information. And revisiting means that you can, for example, if you're learning a particular ending, let's say case ending, you sort of pick one because it has to be small. Don't sort of do the entire system, just one ending. Work with it, and then you can leave it and go and do something else. Let's do verb conjugation or adjectives. And then you sort of on the next curl of the spiral, you come back to that ending, which you were doing. So, which means you reuse it and retrieve it from your long-term memory multiple times. So that's a different kind of retrieval from Ebbinghaus, because you do not repeat the same sentences and the same case forms, grammar forms. And what cognitive psychologists say now, that if you repeat the same kind of retrieval process a lot of the time, the neural paths in your brain become quite strong. They sort of, you perform the action faster. So do you remember when we did declarative and procedural knowledge? So if you just learn the grammar and the vocabulary, you are not going to be able to speak. And my huge inspiration in my research is 19th century linguist Francois Guan. He did exactly that. He wanted to learn German, and he learned all the rules, all the grammar rules of German, and memorized the entire German dictionary and went to Germany. He was very, very frustrated and extremely disappointed when he couldn't comprehend the language, and he realized that people couldn't understand what he was saying. So, but he took it as a challenge, and he came back to France and became the most prominent reformer of European language education at that time. So, and sort of, I believe that he was at the start of sort of language pedagogy. And that's why your theoretical knowledge needs to be recycled in your skills. And remember, there are 4 skills for language learning, and skills are not transferable. If, for example, you recycle this in speaking, it doesn't ensure you'd be good at writing. To be good at writing, you need to revisit that information in writing and make your hand move. And if you're very good at writing and speaking, doesn't necessarily mean you'll be good at listening. So you need to make sure that you practice each of the 4 skills, the reading, the speaking, the writing, and the listening, separately. Because that's what you would be. You would be sort of retrieving the information in a particular neural path, which would be strengthened. So one more, how are we doing this time? We're doing really good. So one more concept which I would like to introduce is the concept of interlanguage. So perhaps I should come back to this. So this ideal sort of second language structure system doesn't happen overnight. So if you look here, you have other structures which are not perfect. They're not complete yet. And that's why this term is called interlanguage. This is what they are. They are learners' individual language system. No interlanguage is the same for all learners have different interlanguages. So, but very importantly, the interlanguage has to be functional, and I will come back to that in a minute. Let's first have a look at this. So, learners interlanguage, so if we imagine that this is the mother tongue structure, yeah, the first language, and this is the target language structure, that's what you're trying to build. Your interlanguage might look something like this. So if you look, it has some of the elements of the mother tongue and some of the elements of the target language. But what is very important, that it has these big gaps. So in second language acquisition, there is a term called noticing. Your job as a learner is to fill these gaps in your system. And to do that, to fill those gaps, you need to notice them. Our brains are very efficient learning systems. And once you notice that there is a bit missing, there is a grammar feature which is not there, or a vocabulary which you're not producing, or you're producing it not quite right, you would start your brain will hang on to it, and will start working on it. So, and you can notice it when you read, when you listen, when you go to your class. And once you noticed, you start producing it. The person who discovered noticing was called Schmidt. And he was a researcher, but he kept a learning diary. And he discovered that not all items that he learned in class, he produced in his speech. And he started looking which items he produced. And he discovered that he only produced those items which he noticed were important. So for you as a learner, it is very important to notice what you're missing and what is important. But more importantly, your interlanguage has to be functional. What does it mean? I remember story which sort of happened a few years ago when we were taking groups to Russia on an educational exchange. And the groups were very mixed. It had some students, not necessarily the ones I taught, and it had some people who hosted Russian kids. They didn't know much Russian. They sort of had like 5 lessons and barely could read and sort of knew a few words. And among the words they knew were thank you, hello, and it was also the word this, or phrase this is, which is eta. And we're queuing to get into Kremlin and discovered that they don't allow people with big bags. And then, of course, then it's the issue, what is considered big. And one of those women who knew bare minimum walked up to the guard, pointed at her bag and said, is this okay? And she used the Russian word this. And the guy sort of looked at her, shrugged his shoulders, and she went. And the whole group went, how did she do that? And that was functional interlanguage, because she had very minimum language information, and she used it. So you're not going to start speaking when you accumulate a lot of grammar and a lot of vocabulary. In fact, if you do that, like that 19th century linguist I was talking about, it makes your life very difficult. So you need to start speaking from the moment you learn a few words. And a little bit of grammar you use, you start using it, start speaking. When I applied this theory to Russian, it was tested in a few universities in the UK, and the largest experiment was in Leeds, a 20-week teaching intervention. And the learning materials were based in this experiment, were published in a book called Russian in Plain English. It's a very small starter for those learning Russian. So if you're learning Russian, that might be a good start. But interestingly, students love this book because we did lots of surveys. And because the book is designed from the point of view of learners processing. So the information is fed. Teachers find these books slightly strange because there are no paradigmatic systems, declension tables, there are no long lists of vocabulary, because every time an item is introduced, it's sort of woven into learner's speech and learner's reading. And ideally for you, if you're a learner, that's how you would need to build your learning. And this is where we come to main takeaways. And so, first of all, if you remember, our tiny working memory can't cope with lots of information at one time. So segment the language information. Sort of do small portions, feed your brain with little bits of information. Connect what you're learning to something you already know. So whatever you're learning, try and find association for it and the link to it. So use new words in different contexts. Don't just repeat words. Quizlet is okay, it's good. Anything you do in the language is good, but there are more effective ways than others. Some ways are more effective than others. So if you try and make different sentences with the same word, it will increase your retrieval ability. So practice grammar in speaking. Yeah, don't learn silently. Speak. Yeah, move your mouth, because our articulatory organs, our tongue and lips, they're muscles, and muscles have muscle memory. So do you remember when you were learning to write when you were little? You were thinking, is why that way or that way? Now you don't, because your hand established a neural connection to your brain, and it now proceduralized. It sort of automatically does it. When you say the same, when you attach the same ending to different words a lot of the time, or use the same word in different contexts, you will proceduralize the process. So say things relevant to you and your environment. We talked about contextualization, make links and associations. Very importantly, do not translate. There is research which shows that translators and fluent bilinguals use different areas of the brain. So which means the skills that they train are different. So if you try and formulate the sentence in your native language, in your first language, and try and flip it into your target language, first of all, the structure might be not the same. So, and you might quickly run into words which you don't know. And funnily enough, a very simple fact, you cannot say something which is not in your brain. But that's a dilemma which many learners will run into when they start speaking. They start saying something and then they go, oh, I don't know this word. Okay, so you need to find the word you do know, rephrase, restructure, give up on the detail. So make you into language functional. Yeah, learn things which would enable you to use the language, enable you to speak. So construct your sentences from the words you know. So to speak, do not formulate it in your first language first. Think of a target word, L2 word, and try and add something else to it. Verb is helpful if you know, and then you more or less have a sentence. Sentences don't have to be large. Yeah, you have to start somewhere and build it in a spiral. So create a language buddy. It's not a person. All my students have language buddies. It's an image on your device associated with your target language, with the language you're learning, and you talk to them. Our brains, I actually was saying it to my group this morning, there is research to show that bilingual children, for example, associate a language with a face. I have a bilingual daughter, and when she was little, her dad was speaking English and I was speaking Russian, and that's how it was. And when I once talking to someone else swung around and talked to her in English, she cried because that was a face which was associated with Russian, and it suddenly spoke the wrong language. So if you create an image, and it can be an avatar, it can be, I have students speaking to Dostoevsky or a famous Russian actress, it doesn't matter, or somebody, a relative perhaps, who speaks your language. Target language, and talk to them. Your brain will attach that face to a language. That would make your speaking exam much, much easier, because what will happen, that image is swapped with the examinee, and your brain goes, oh yes, I know how to do that. I will do this. So the oral exam will suddenly become much, much easier. So there are 3 rules for a language buddy, if you ever decide to get one. First of all, you never say the same thing twice, which means you very quickly run out of comfort zone. Yeah, you run out of sentences which you say a lot. Okay, so you would have to experiment. The second one, make it relevant, which we talked about it already, but don't talk about yourself all the time. Use other grammar forms. Talk about somebody else, your friend, your family member, or use plurals. Talk about a few friends. Use past tense. Another rule is you need to make sure that you use it regularly. So it doesn't have to be much, 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day. If you're doing a degree in language, you might increase that. But find a time in a day when you're going to be able to do that. A lot of my students do it at breakfast, but not necessarily. When they stick the image on, and while they're running around the kitchen, they try and say a few sentences. But you also need to take the new information there all the time. Don't sit on the same level. Don't sit in your comfort zone. You've learned something in class, read something in the book, take it to your buddy and expand your sentences. Don't make them enormously long. You can do a few sentences. Yeah, do stories. Talk about what you read or what you saw on the telly. So notice the gaps. We talked about noticing. And notice the gaps in your interlanguage and work on filling them. And once you start working, your brain is a very efficient system. It would work hard for you. So this is in a nutshell. I think I would like to say thank you to everybody. So I think we finished slightly earlier, so we have a little bit more time for questions, and hopefully there will be lots of questions. Shall I stop sharing? Yeah?
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalia. There's so many amazing, exciting insights. We have many questions for you. So
that's brilliant. I love questions.
Let's see. I will start with the first questions. And here I have, is the size of the working memory the same in all humans?
That's an excellent question. It's sort of not the same. That's the sort of straightforward answer. But no human can hold more than 7 items, as I mentioned. So it's tiny for all humans, but there is a different tiny. There are, how do I say, tools to measure your size of working memory. For example, if you're interested, you can use millisecond inquisite. So if you virtually key in millisecond inquisite working memory, it will give you the free working memory test if you're interested. And if you just take the raw scores, it's sort of 40, 50, it's an average. And sort of if you get 60 plus, that's quite reasonable size of working memory. And if anything below, it's a smaller working memory. But what this means, it doesn't mean that you can't learn. What it does mean, it means you need different strategies. I actually had, in one of my experiments, I had a participant who had extremely small working memory, extremely small. He was doing a PhD. He actually worked out how his brain works. That's why I think it's individual. We all learn in different ways, and you need to know how you learn. Okay, great question.
Yeah. Next question. I'm concerned that if I practice speaking on my own, I will say things wrong and would not know that they are wrong. What is your opinion on that?
That's actually the question which I'm asked quite a lot, particularly when I talk about buddies. What I mentioned, that our brains are extremely efficient learning systems. And yes, you might make a mistake, but your brains would learn from it. As long as you sort of read and listen, and you might go to a class and analyze what you read and listen, your brain would notice that things don't add up. For example, if you used one ending and then you read and that ending is different, your brain goes, "Ooh, there is discrepancy there," right? And it's not my personal opinion. There is research in second language acquisition, and there is a lot of research now, which shows, for example, that peer communication, which is the other worry. People sometimes think, what if I hear he makes a mistake and then I'll copy it? So peer communication results in improved skill, in improved language production. So don't worry about it, but as long as you analyze the form and as long as you practice your noticing, yeah, you'll be all right.
Great. Next question. How does the brain change with the more languages you learn?
That's a great question, because you're you are really asking about multilingualism and bilingualism. So as such, I'm not a specialist in bilingualism, but I'm interested in it. And recently I've been invited to a book presentation of Viorica Marie, which is on how it's called The Power of Language. So if you're interested in that, that's the book to read. And what the book says is that it's sort of our brain adjusts to handling two coding systems, because having different languages, it's basically having different coding systems. And in the past, there was a theory that we handle them separately, that this is the Russian mode, this is the English mode, this is the Spanish mode. Apparently now, they say that retrieval is very often parallel, that when bilinguals are trying to sort of say something, they have more choices. Yeah, their brains sort of calculate which one is the optimum choice. So what your brains also would do, they would compare things, yeah, in different languages. So you will hear bilinguals very often say, oh, it's like in that language, or it's like in that language. It's actually useful because you analyze. So analyzing things at deeper levels and comparing things would help you learn. There is a theory of deeper learning, which I'm not going into, just because of the scale of this a lecture, but if you're interested, you can in deeper learning and sort of see what that involves. So having a few languages doesn't guarantee, but so that you would sort of would be absolutely amazing at all languages, but it does help.
Okay, I think we have a sort of a related question. Does the ease of language learning go up or down the more languages one learns?
First of all, can I start with not answering that directly? Because we all learn in very different ways. If I learned anything from my research, it's that all our brains are very different, and we percept and understand things differently, and we most certainly learn differently. And language learning, as any other learning, is individual. But if you managed a few languages, it probably means that your brain enjoys learning languages. So, which it sort of expands your knowledge of language structure, if that makes sense. That you sort of can compare the structures and sort of see how the structures work. So you can anticipate what would happen if X, then Z. Yeah, you sort of see, it's probably because in that language works like that, so it probably works in a new language like this. But it also depends a lot how you learned your languages. Because unfortunately, I had students who learned languages by sort of communicating in a family, which means they are bilingual, but they never learned the structure of the language, which means learning a third language was actually problematic. It was challenging because the knowledge of the structure wasn't there. So that's why sort of I am in favor of deep learning, understanding the structure and working with the form. That would definitely help you. And then it's up to you how much time and effort you can dedicate to learning a language.
Thank you.
I hope I answered that.
Yes, thank you, Natalia.
Mhm.
The next question is related to AI. So, how can we integrate AI in learning a language?
That's a very good question because when I start talking to my new groups about language buddies, that's one of the most common questions which started popping up recently. Can't we use AI? And I went to a great presentation a couple of years ago in the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages at SEAL. And the team specifically researched the use of AI for developing learners speaking. And unfortunately, their verdict was a no. Because they said for beginners, you need to write sheets and sheets and sheets of instructions for AI produce the appropriate language. Because it's very often like native speakers, when a learner tries to speak to them, they produce so much language, it drowns the learner. And that's what AI can do, unless you absolutely specify exactly what you want it to produce. And I have a wonderful colleague who's sitting in our staff room who actually tries to do that, to sort of write those sheets of instruction and sort of create an AI image of my buddy. And he's done quite well, but he dedicates quite a lot of time to writing those instructions. If that's something which fascinates you, perhaps you'll create an AI which would work like this. But for advanced speakers, unfortunately, the no is because when you're at advanced level, you want a discussion. You want to argue a point, particularly if you're doing a degree in language, and you start arguing. AI is programmed not to argue. So you say, for example, I don't believe that your information is wrong, and AI goes, yeah, you're right. So that's why it's sort of, I'm sure it will develop, but at this stage, I haven't had a successful sort of experiment which would make me excited about it.
Yeah. So now we're moving on to more specific questions, I imagine coming from language teachers. So one question is such: how do you get to generalization of grammatical patterns?
And that's a great question because I think what I said earlier on, if it is a question of a teacher, so I always start with a very sort of simple sort of phrase and something which they can learn, and which sort of produces a chunk very often. But I always try and go away from it very quickly. Like in my lesson 5, we have an activity when they don't even know all the alphabet yet. But I introduced the first case ending, which is connected to location. In Russian, if something or somebody is in a particular place, you need to put the year at the end of it. And what I ask people to do is to write the names of 5 people they know who live in different cities. And but cities have to be in random order. And then they swap lists. And their job is to basically find out who is where. And the sentences they would come up with, they would read a name and they go, David, then put the word in, which is ver, and then London with an ending, London, yeah. And the answer might be no. And then they try somebody else, David in Manchester, and so on. So because they apply this to different items, the brains, which are very efficient learning systems, go, oh yeah, I figured out how to do this. Do you understand what I mean? So I sort of prompt them to generalize it. And sometimes when the item is not very frequent, like in if you have some kind of little subcluster, like in Russian we have monosyllabics, which are sort of have a different ending. What I do, I give them one chunk and they learn in the garden. And they go, look, that technically is not an exception. You will have other words which do this, but at the moment you don't know them. And then a few weeks later, when we get round to another word, I go, oh, do you remember I told you it's like in the garden? And that falls on the familiar information, connect all to new, but they already got the pattern for it, which then means they can generalize to the next monosyllabic. When they see another word, I go, what do you think would happen with that one? And a lot of them would say, yeah, it's like in the garden. So I sort of prompt them, I push them. If you don't have a teacher, comparing and analyzing the form would get you there. There is theory of implicit learning, but it's sort of very controversial. So, and particularly in instructional settings, implicit learning doesn't always deliver the results which are required. And it's not to say that we don't learn implicitly, we do, but when the results need to be quickly within the tight syllables, it's not as effective.
Moving on to another question. So what you mentioned about translation and never translate, the question is here. I teach one-to-one English classes and my students often want to translate vocabulary to fully understand the meaning. Should I discourage this?
It's a good question, because when I said do not translate, I was referring, perhaps I wasn't clear, I'm sorry. I was referring specifically when you're learning to speak, right? When, if you look at my book, I translate vocabulary. So when I introduce an item, when I teach in class, I sometimes show an item, but in the book, doesn't always work. So I do give the translation. But when you speak and try and use an item, that's when I would discourage translation. I basically say, do not formulate the full sentence. Do you remember my Lego blocks? That's how I think you should be structuring your sentence. Find one word which you're going to try and use in your sentence and try and see what other word would link to it. And you basically, if you found subject verb, you already got the sentence, and you add something else and you're done. And that's how you would construct sentences. So that do not translate was specific to speaking. I also, sometimes what I do, if we read something in Russian, because I teach Russian, I do not necessarily say translate. I say read and understand. And as long as they understand what they're reading, that's good enough for me. But sometimes when the structure is complex or tricky, I do ask them, I said, how would you formulate that in English? So I never actually use the word translate, and that's deliberate. So I would say how, for example, we have a very funny structure I have. I don't say translate because they can come up with by me is owned. I don't want that. I said, how would you formulate that sentence in English? And they would come up with the correct I have structure. So hopes that's helpful.
Thank you. One viewer is asking to please remind the name of your book.
Oh, it's Russian in Plain English. And if you key that in, normally my book comes up. Please remember, it's not a full course book. It's a starter. It would do sort of the first 10 to 20 hours, depending how you use it. If you use the full book, it will cover the first 20 hours. And it's Routledge. Their website, they deliver free postage anywhere in the world, but it can be bought on other websites. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I think we have only 1 minute left, so maybe it's a good time to thank you again for such a wonderful lunch hour. I hope everybody enjoyed very much. So at this point,
can I say?
Absolutely, yes, go ahead.
I think we're finished, but do contact me if you're interested.
Not all questions were answered, unfortunately, so, but I'm sure Natalia is happy to answer more
Yeah,
questions
please email
via
me. Find me on
email.
UCL website and or in LinkedIn as well. So I would be happy if you're interested. I would be happy to talk to you.
Also, I'd like to draw your attention to this QR code that we have on the screen right now. This is for you to leave some feedback. It's a very tiny survey, just 2 minutes, multiple choice, but would be very useful for us. And I would like to also remind you that we have a next lunch hour lecture on 23rd of October at 1 o'clock. The topic of the lecture is Life Underneath the Ice Shelf. So please join us on the 23rd, and thank you very much for your kind attention and very nice questions. Thank you, Natalia.
And thank you very much, Vita, for hosting this.